The Detroit Pistons are building something special. This previous season and over the past couple seasons, the Pistons have been one of those teams that have been rebuilding, but at the same time have somewhat been struggling within that rebuild. But in my opinion, when you look at the roster that they have now and what they've built over the last couple seasons and what they were able to add during this previous season's draft and also free agency period, I finally feel as if the Detroit Pistons are actually building something special. And if they continue on the path that they're currently going on, I think the Pistons have a real chance to be a really good team in the long-term future. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports. I make opinionated NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. I also want to quickly mention that I recently started up an MMA channel, and if you guys are interested in that, the link will be in the description. But anyways, let's get into it. Over the more recent history, the Detroit Pistons just seem to be one of those teams that constantly found themselves in the midst of a rebuild and also constantly found themselves to be one of the worst teams in the NBA. And a huge reason for why that was due to the fact that the Pistons would be in a certain rebuild, but around halfway through it, they decided certain players that they had that were main parts of that rebuild just weren't working out for them, or there were certain other moves that they made that just didn't really pan out, and they would decide to go in the direction of a completely different rebuild and basically just start over. And when you're a team and an organization that is constantly going through different rebuilds without showing all that much success, that kind of shows you and puts you in the situation that the Pistons were in. But over the last couple seasons, although the Pistons once again were one of the worst teams in the NBA, I finally feel as if they have certain players on the roster that I feel could have real potential going forward in the long-term future, and I think they are finally building something and they definitely are headed in the right direction. But a question that some of you may be having at this point is why? Why do I feel that the Pistons are actually headed in the right direction after a ton of seasons of being a dysfunctional franchise? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to a couple different factors, but clearly the main factor has to be the overall talent that they currently have on the roster. Now, when you look at this Detroit Pistons team, they have guys like Cade Cunningham, who's a guy who I'm extremely excited about his potential. Even James Wiseman has been a pretty nice pickup for them. He was a guy that was previously a very high overall selection with the Warriors, and although his career didn't necessarily pan out all that well with them, I think in a different situation with the Pistons, who have a completely different timeline, I think that actually gives him a chance to really thrive in Detroit. But besides him, they have Jaden Ivey, who was also a pretty high draft selection, who's another guy who has a lot of scoring potential in the long-term future, I feel at least. They have Killian Hayes, who once again, although wasn't necessarily the most successful early on in his career, I do still think there is a chance for him. Jalen Duren is a guy who they just recently picked up. I'm excited to see what he could potentially be. Isaiah Stewart is another guy who I like his potential. Marvin Bagley even is another guy. And even besides that, they have some nice veterans on their team as well, like Bojan Bogdanovic, who's a guy who's been in the NBA for a really long time. He's a veteran presence out there. He's a guy who's not only going to be a very productive player for you on the court, but just having that veteran presence on an otherwise very young roster is of course going to be a huge benefit to these guys. But besides him, they have Joe Harris, Alec Burks, Monty Morris. There's just a bunch of different veterans that are nicely sprinkled into this otherwise young team. And overall, when you look at this roster from top to bottom, there's actually a lot to like. And even though the Pistons weren't a good team last year, I do think they have a real chance to be a much better team this upcoming season, in part due to the overall talent that they have on the roster and also the nice balance they have between younger players and veterans. Now, the next reason for why I think the Pistons have a bright future ahead of them is actually due to their front office. Now, when you talk about the Pistons front office in the previous years, they've always been known as an organization that has been somewhat dysfunctional. They've made poor decisions in the draft, they made poor decisions in free agency, they made poor decisions in trades, even poor decisions in hirings throughout their organization, and due to that, they've just become a very dysfunctional franchise, and people saw the Pistons front office as just not a good one. But when you look at some of the moves they've been making as of late, whether you talk about the draft picks, some of the younger guys they have on the roster, you talk about some of the signings they've made within their organization, like most recently their new head coach in Monty Williams, alongside with some of the players they brought in free agency, I actually do think the Pistons are doing a much better job, and they're proving to be a much more competent front office than they ever were in the past. And having the right guys in the right positions in your front office is actually one of the most important things you can have as an organization. Because no matter how good or how bad things are for your organization at that point, if you have the right guys in the right positions, they'll be able to either take you out of a bad situation, or if you're in a good situation, they'll push you that much further forward. So I actually do like what the Pistons have at this current moment with their front office and what they're doing going forward, and due to that, I do think the Pistons actually have a pretty bright future ahead of themselves. Now, the next factor for why I think the Pistons actually have a really bright future ahead of themselves is due to something that I mentioned in my last point, but is due to the new head coaching signing in Monty Williams. Now, Monty Williams is a guy who was the head coach of the Phoenix Suns for a decent amount of time, and although the Suns had a ton of talent on the roster, Monty also did a great job with those guys. He was the guy that Phoenix brought in, and once he got to the Suns, he kind of helped them turn things around. Because before he got there, the Suns were actually struggling quite a bit. They were basically never making the playoffs. They weren't really making it all that close either, but ever since Monty got there, he did a really nice job at changing the culture and helping these guys just play better as a team and help them win a lot more. And due to that, the Suns were able to attract some other guys via free agency. They were able to acquire some guys via trade, and they currently have an absolute powerhouse when you look at the amount of talent they have on the roster currently. But people do forget that Monty Williams did play a huge role in turning things around in Phoenix. And when you look at what the Pistons have on their roster, as I mentioned before, I do actually think they have a good amount of talent. And when you bring in a high character head coach like Monty Williams, I do think he could do a tremendous job at helping turn things around for the Detroit Pistons organization. And if Monty is successful with that, a lot of these younger guys are just naturally going to get better with that kind of influence within the organization, but also other guys that are potential free agents going forward are going to see the Pistons as a much more attractive team than they probably otherwise would have. So I actually do think the addition of Monty Williams is huge, not just due to on the court things, but also due to off the court things as well. But with all that being said, and although I do think the Pistons actually have a ton of exciting things happening on the horizon, at the end of the day, I think fans need to realize and recognize that this is a very young team and they need to be very patient with these guys. Because when you look at what the Pistons just did last season, they were definitely one of the worst teams in the NBA, and they definitely had a pretty rough season. And although I do think in this upcoming season, the Pistons should make some improvements and they should be a better team than they were last year, at the end of the day, people just need to be very patient with these guys. Because most of the players on this organization are very young guys. Either they're rookies or they just were rookies recently. So it's going to take some time for these guys to adjust to the NBA level, not only individually, but also adjust to their teammates and learn how to win at the NBA level. So overall, people just need to be very patient with this organization, and every level of success is definitely going to be a positive for these guys, and maybe in 3 or 4 years from now, we can have much higher expectations for this team. But I guess only time will tell what does end up happening, not only this upcoming season for the Pistons, but also in the long-term future. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Pistons actually have a really bright future, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now. And until the next time, peace out, guys.